I need to tell you something that took me years in the health and fitness industry to make peace with. Beer might be the most human thing ever made. Not the healthiest, not the most nutritionally optimal, not something I'm going to tell you to drink more of, but human in the deepest, most archaeological, most civilization-shaping sense of the word. We have been making beer for at least 7,000 years, possibly 10,000. Some researchers think the desire to make fermented grain beverages may have been one of the reasons we started farming in the first place. Not bread, beer. Beer built the pyramids. Beer kept medieval Europe alive when the water would have killed them. Beer funded the American Revolution. Beer was, for most of human history, not a vice. It was infrastructure. And today, on this show, we're going to give it the treatment it deserves. The full history, the honest science, and a practical guide for those of you who enjoy it and want to do so without lying to yourselves about what it is. Because it is a toxin, and it is also ancient and communal, and occasionally delicious. All these things can be true. Let's find out how. I'm Zach Sykes. This is Eat or Die, Stories from the Human Table, from Renegade Health Group. We've talked about protein, grains, and magnesium, all worthy, all important, all things your doctor might tell you to have more of. Today we're talking about beer, which your doctor will probably tell you to drink less of. And by the end of this episode, you'll understand exactly why. And also why 10,000 years of human beings disagree. And why they weren't entirely wrong. This is a long one. Get comfortable. Maybe grab something to drink. Let's go. Beer, at its most elemental, is fermented grain water. That's reductive, but not wrong. Take a grain, historically barley, but wheat, corn, rice, sorghum, and others have all been used. And you get that grain wet. Allow it to sprout slightly in a process called malting, which converts its starches to sugars. You steep those malted grains in hot water, producing a sweet liquid called wort. You add hops for bitterness, aroma, and preservation, and then you introduce yeast, a single-celled fungus that consumes those sugars and produces as its waste products ethanol and carbon dioxide. The ethanol is why people drink it. The carbon dioxide is why it bubbles. The hops are why it's bitter. The malted grain is why it has color, body, and that specific toasty depth that distinguishes a good beer from fizzy nothing. Nutritionally, beer contains small amounts of B vitamins, particularly folate, niacin, and B6, derived from the yeast and grain. It contains silicon, which has some evidence for bone health. It contains polyphenols from the hops and the malt. It contains fiber in very modest quantities, and it contains, depending on the style, between 4 and 10% alcohol by volume, which is a psychoactive compound that is, technically speaking, a cellular toxin. We'll get to that. First, 10,000 years of history. The oldest direct evidence of beer production comes from a site called Godin Tepe in the Zagros Mountains of western Iran. Archaeologists found residue in ancient ceramic vessels dating to around 3500 BCE, chemical signatures of barley beer. But that's just the oldest surviving physical evidence. The actual practice is almost certainly older. Much older. In 2018, archaeologists working at Rakfet Cave in Israel, a site associated with the Natufian culture, a pre-agricultural society that lived between roughly 13,000 and 9,700 BCE, found stone mortars with residue suggesting the deliberate fermentation of grain-based beverages. 13,000 years ago. Before writing, before the wheel, before farming as we traditionally understand it. This finding lit up the archaeological community for a specific reason. It lent credibility to what some researchers had been quietly suggesting for decades. The standard story of agriculture says that humans began farming grain in order to make bread, to secure a reliable food source. But some archaeologists, most prominently Patrick McGovern of the University of Pennsylvania, have argued that fermented beverages may have been at least as powerful a motivation. That the desire for reliable, repeated access to alcoholic drinks drove or at least significantly contributed to the domestication of grain. The bread or beer debate, as it's sometimes called, remains genuinely unresolved. What's not debated is this: wherever humans began farming grain, they also began fermenting it. The two practices appear together everywhere, always. You cannot untangle them. Beer and civilization are, from the very beginning, the same story. Now, the Sumerians of ancient Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, were the world's first documented brewers, and they took it seriously in a way that should command respect. The hymn to Ninkasi, written around 1800 BCE, is simultaneously a religious text honoring the Sumerian goddess of beer and a functional brewing recipe. It describes in poetic detail the malting, mashing, and fermentation process for Sumerian beer. It is the oldest surviving beer recipe in the world. The fact that their brewing instructions were also a prayer tells you something about how central beer was to Sumerian life. Sumerian workers, on construction projects, in temple complexes, in agricultural operations, received daily beer rations as part of their wages. The ration varied by social status. Laborers got about a liter a day. Mid-level administrators got 2, and high officials got 5. Beer was not a luxury. It was compensation. It was currency. It was, in the most literal sense, how their economy ran. The beer itself was thick, cloudy, drunk through reed straws to filter out the grain chaff. It was low alcohol by modern standards, closer to what we'd call small beer, and it provided calories, B vitamins, and something to drink that wasn't going to kill you. In a world without water treatment, that last point was not trivial. Across the ancient world, Egypt, China, even the Americas, variations of the same pattern appear independently. Grain is cultivated, grain is fermented, and the fermented beverage becomes economically, socially, and ritually central. The specific grain changes, The specific process changes, but the fundamental human behavior is universal. We find a way to make alcohol, and then we organize society partly around it. We touched on Egypt in the grains episode, but we need to come back because the Egyptian beer story is quite extraordinary. The pyramid workers at Giza, the men and women who quarried, transported, and placed the limestone blocks of one of the ancient world's greatest construction projects, were paid partly in bread and partly in beer. Archaeological excavations of the workers' village at Giza have revealed industrial-scale bakeries and breweries operating side by side. The logistics were staggering. Estimates suggest the workforce of up to 10,000 people required the production of thousands of liters of beer every day. Egyptian beer, called heket, was nutritious by ancient standards. Made from emmer wheat and barley, fermented with naturally occurring wild yeasts, it was rich in B vitamins. It provided significant calories, and it was far safer to drink than the Nile water, which carried parasites and pathogens that would have devastated a large workforce. Beer in Egypt was also medicine. Egyptian medical documents, like the Ebers Papyrus, list beer as an ingredient or vehicle for hundreds of remedies. For digestive complaints, for dental pain, for skin conditions, for easing childbirth. The Egyptians were not confused about what beer was. They understood it had effects, and they used those effects deliberately and medicinally, thousands of years before anyone understood fermentation chemistry. There is something genuinely moving about that. A civilization that built structures we still cannot fully explain, that had a sophisticated understanding of mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, and that paid its greatest workforce partly in fermented grain water, understood it was doing them a nutritional service, and prayed to a goddess to ensure the quality of the brew. Ninkasi would have approved. Now jump forward a few thousand years and several thousand miles. Medieval Europe, specifically the problem of water. Urban water sources in medieval Europe were, by modern standards, catastrophically contaminated. Rivers and wells that served as drinking sources were also the recipients of animal waste, human sewage, industrial runoff from tanneries and slaughterhouses, and the general biological chaos of densely populated pre-sanitation cities. Drinking untreated water in a medieval city was dangerous. Cholera, typhoid, dysentery, all waterborne, all potentially lethal. Beer was safer. The brewing process, specifically the boiling of the wort, killed pathogens. The alcohol content of the finished beer, even the relatively low alcohol table beers consumed daily, it was sufficient to inhibit the growth of most dangerous microorganisms. And the hops, which became dominant as a preservative in European brewing from around the 12th century onward, had their own antimicrobial properties. This is not a romantic exaggeration. This is microbiology before anyone understood microbiology. Medieval Europeans drank beer, including children, including pregnant women, including monks, not because they wanted to get drunk, at least not primarily, but because it was the safest thing available to drink. The alcohol content was often low enough that functional daily consumption didn't produce significant intoxication. Small beer, low-alcohol table beer brewed specifically for everyday consumption, was a dietary staple across all social classes. The monasteries of medieval Europe, they deserve special recognition in beer history. Benedictine and Cistercian monks were among the most sophisticated brewers of the medieval period, refining techniques, experimenting with ingredients, and producing beers of quality that commercial operations couldn't match. Their motivations were partly practical. Monks needed to sustain themselves through long fasting periods, and beer provided calories when food was restricted. But also partly economic. Monastery beer was sold to pilgrims and travelers, generating significant income. The Reinheitsgebot, the Bavarian beer purity law of 1516, is often cited as the world's oldest surviving food regulation. It specified that beer could only be made from water, barley, and hops. Yeast wasn't listed because its role wasn't yet understood. The law was partly about quality control, partly about protecting the grain supply from competition with bakers, and partly about taxation. Even in 1516, beer was too economically important to leave unregulated. Now, while Europeans were perfecting barley and hop brewing, the civilizations of the Americas had developed their own fermented grain traditions, independently and with equal sophistication. Chicha, fermented corn beer, was the central ritual and economic beverage of the Inca Empire. The production of chicha was a specialized, highly organized operation. Chosen women, called, and I'm hoping I pronounce this right, aclias, were responsible for its production in state facilities called acliahuasis. Chicha was consumed at state ceremonies, distributed to laborers on imperial construction projects, and offered to the gods. The traditional production method for chicha involves chewing the corn before fermenting it, a process that sounds alarming until you understand the chemistry. Human saliva contains amylase, an enzyme that converts starch to sugar. The chewing was a pre-industrial method of kick-starting saccharification, the same process that malting achieves in barley brewing. Different technique, same biochemical goal, same result: fermented grain water that sustained an empire. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Americas in the 16th century, they brought European brewing traditions with them and found fermented grain traditions already flourishing. The collision of these two brewing cultures is part of the larger, often brutal story of colonial contact. But the underlying human behavior, the universal drive to ferment grain and produce alcohol, was once again the same on both sides of the ocean. The 19th century changed beer in ways that would have been unrecognizable to a Sumerian brewer or a medieval monk. Louis Pasteur's work on fermentation in the 1850s and 1860s, conducted partly at the request of French brewers who were having consistency problems, established that fermentation was caused by living microorganisms, not spontaneous chemical processes. This was not just a beer insight. This was one of the foundational discoveries of microbiology. Pasteur's work on beer led directly to germ theory, to pasteurization, and to the modern understanding of infectious disease. Beer, in a very real sense, helped give us modern medicine. The development of refrigeration in the late 19th century allowed year-round lager brewing. Lagers require cold fermentation. That was previously only possible in winter or in alpine caves. The spread of refrigerated rail transport allowed beer to be brewed in one location and consumed in another for the first time. The industry consolidated, regional variation diminished. The era of mass-produced pale lager, light, consistent, inoffensive, and dominant, had begun. Prohibition in the United States, 1920 to 1933, was one of the great self-inflicted wounds in American food history. It didn't stop drinking. It drove it underground, handed the industry to organized crime, eliminated thousands of small regional breweries that had taken generations to build, and reduced American beer culture to the handful of large industrial producers who had the resources to survive and pivot to near beer and other legal products. When Prohibition ended, what recovered was not the diverse American brewing landscape that had existed before. What recovered was mass production. Adjunct lagers, beers brewed with corn or rice to reduce cost and lighten the flavor, became the American standard. By the mid-20th century, American beer was, by global standards, thin. The craft beer revolution, beginning in the 1970s and accelerating dramatically from the 90s onward, is the story of a correction. Home brewers, small regional breweries, and eventually a full cultural movement pushed back against the homogenization of beer. Today, the United States has more than 9,000 breweries, more than at any point in its history, including before Prohibition. The range of styles, ingredients, and quality available is extraordinary. Beer came back. It always does. The professor is in, and the professor has been waiting for this episode. We're going to talk about ethanol. Specifically, what happens inside your body from the moment you take your first sip to the moment you wake up the next morning wishing you hadn't taken quite so many. Buckle up. Ethanol, which is the alcohol in the alcoholic beverages, it's a small, simple molecule. 2 carbon atoms, 6 hydrogen atoms, and 1 oxygen atom. Its smallness is the key to everything that follows, because it means it can go essentially everywhere in your body. It crosses the blood-brain barrier. It crosses cell membranes. It distributes into virtually every tissue. When you drink beer, you're flooding your entire body with a psychoactive molecule that has preferential access to your central nervous system. Ethanol is classified pharmacologically as a central nervous system depressant. And this confuses people because the initial effect of drinking often feels like stimulation. It has increased energy, reduced inhibition, elevated mood. That's real. But it's not stimulation. It's selective depression. The first thing alcohol depresses is the brain's inhibitory systems, specifically GABA-mediated inhibition, which keeps your exciting signals in check. When you remove the brakes first, everything feels like acceleration. But the brakes were doing something important. Now, your liver is the primary site of that alcohol metabolism, and it handles ethanol with a 2-step enzymatic process that deserves respect for its elegance and also sympathy for its limitations. Step 1, an enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase, or ADH, converts ethanol to acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde is significantly more toxic than ethanol. It's a known carcinogen. It's responsible for most of the cellular damage associated with heavy alcohol consumption, and it's a major contributor to those symptoms of a hangover. Step 2, a second enzyme, aldehyde dehydrogenase, converts acetaldehyde into acetate, which is then broken down to carbon dioxide and water and eliminated. This step is that detoxification. When it's working efficiently, acetaldehyde moves through quickly. When it doesn't, due to genetic variation, acetaldehyde accumulates, producing flushing, nausea, and rapid heart rate. This is that flush response. It's not a quirk. It's your liver telling you in the clearest possible terms that it cannot process this compound fast enough. The liver can metabolize approximately 1 standard drink per hour, and that rate will not speed up because you're drinking coffee or eating food or taking a cold shower. Those things will change how you feel, but they're not going to change how fast your liver works. There is no hack. The liver sets this pace. So let's walk through what's actually happening neurologically as you drink. 1 drink in, your blood alcohol content rising toward 0.02 to 0.04%. GABA receptors activated, glutamate receptors, that's the exciting system for the brain we talked about, they begin to be inhibited. Dopamine is released into the nucleus accumbens, the brain's reward center. You feel relaxed, slightly warm, mildly euphoric. This is the pleasant part. This is what beer has been selling for 10,000 years. 2 to 3 drinks in, that blood alcohol around 0.05 to 0.08%. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for your judgment, your planning, your impulse control, it's now going to be meaningfully impaired. This is why the 3rd drink always seems like such a great idea. The part of your brain that would evaluate that decision is the part that's been sedated. Reaction time slows, coordination diminishes, you become, in measurable terms, worse at most things, while feeling like you're better at all of them. Now, 4 or more drinks, blood alcohol pushing 0.1 and above, your cerebellum is impaired. Balance, coordination degrade noticeably. Memory consolidation is disrupted. Your hippocampus is even struggling. At a high enough blood alcohol content, anterograde amnesia, the blackout. You are conscious. You're moving through the world, but your brain is not forming long-term memories of any of it. The lights are on, but the recording equipment is off. And the morning after. The hangover, that's not primarily caused by dehydration, though alcohol is a diuretic and dehydration does contribute. The primary culprits are that acetaldehyde accumulation, systemic inflammation driven by alcohol metabolism, disrupted sleep architecture. Alcohol does suppress REM sleep, so even 8 hours of post-drinking sleep is not restorative. And reactive hypoglycemia as the liver prioritizes alcohol metabolism over blood glucose. The hangover is your body simply filing a formal complaint. Now, for years, the research literature suggested a J-shaped curve for alcohol and cardiovascular health. Light to moderate drinkers had better outcomes than heavy drinkers, and intriguingly also slightly better outcomes than abstainers. And this finding, of course, drove enormous enthusiasm for the idea that moderate drinking was actually good for you. The scientific community has significantly walked that back. A major reanalysis published in The Lancet in 2018, the Global Burden of Disease Study, covering 195 countries, concluded that the safest level of alcohol consumption is 0 when accounting for total health outcomes, including cancer risk. The apparent cardiovascular benefit in earlier studies is likely confounded by the fact that many abstainers are actually former heavy drinkers who quit due to health problems, making them a sicker comparison group than they actually appear. What we can say with confidence, heavy alcohol consumption, which is more than 14 drinks per week for men, more than 7 for women, is clearly harmful across multiple organ systems. the liver, the heart, the brain, the gut microbiome, sleep quality, cancer risk, all negatively affected. This is not contested. What does remain genuinely murky is whether low to moderate consumption carries meaningful health risk for an otherwise healthy adult, or whether the risks at that level are small enough to be outweighed by, well, the enjoyment of living a human life that sometimes includes a beer. The professor does not make that call for you. The professor just presents the data. You're an adult. All right. Here's where I give you the framework and get out of your way. I'm a fitness professional and a health coach. I'm not a prohibitionist, but I'm also not going to tell you alcohol is fine in any amount because that's what you want to hear. The honest position is somewhere in the middle, and it requires you to think about your own situation rather than apply a universal rule. Alcohol is a toxin. It's not an opinion. It's a biochemical classification. Ethanol is metabolized through acetaldehyde, which damages cells, stresses the liver, disrupts sleep, and increases cancer risk with chronic exposure. These are facts. Alcohol is also ancient, social, and for many people a genuine source of pleasure and connection. These are also facts. Pretending otherwise is not health coaching. It's moralizing dressed up as science. The question for any individual is not whether alcohol is risk-free. It's not. But whether the risk at their level of consumption are acceptable given what they get in return. That is a personal calculation. I can give you the inputs. You do the math. Now, not all beer is created equal. So here's how to think about it. Your better choices. Craft ales, stouts, porters tend to have a higher antioxidant content from the malt and the hops than your mass-produced lagers. Dark beers, particularly stouts, have meaningful levels of polyphenols and iron. They're also often more satisfying per glass, which can naturally reduce your total consumption. A well-made stout at 5% alcohol by volume that you drink slowly and enjoy fully is a better choice than 4 light lagers you barely taste. Lower alcohol by volume options, session ales, low alcohol beers, or the growing category of very well-made near beers are worth exploring if you want the social and sensory experience with less pharmacological load. The quality of this category has improved dramatically. Many are genuinely good. German-style Hefeweizens and Belgian Witbiers have reasonable B vitamin content from the wheat and yeast. Not a health food, but a slightly more nutritionally present option than your adjunct lagers. Now the worst choices. Mass-produced adjunct lagers. Your major American commercial brands, that I won't name here so they don't get mad at me, are nutritionally the thinnest option. They're actually corn or rice-based, low in everything except calories and alcohol. They're not evil, but they offer the least of what beer has to offer while providing the full pharmacological load. High alcohol by volume craft beers, double IPAs, imperial stouts at 10% and above, are, dose for dose, significantly more alcohol than they appear. A 10% imperial stout in a 16-ounce pour is the alcohol equivalent of 3.5 standard drinks. Many people consume these without adjusting their mental accounting. Adjust your mental accounting. Sweet, fruit-forward beers and hard seltzers, they often carry sugar loads that compound the metabolic effects of alcohol. You're getting the alcohol, and the blood sugar spike simultaneously. Not ideal. So if you drink beer, here's a simple framework worth applying. Know your actual number. A standard drink of 12 ounces of beer at 5% alcohol by volume. Many craft beers are 7, 8, 9%. Do the division. Know what you're actually consuming, not what the glass implies. Drink with food. Alcohol absorbed alongside food has a significantly slower and more blunted effect on blood sugar and peak blood alcohol content. It's not a free pass, but it's meaningfully better than drinking on an empty stomach. Hydrate in parallel. Your liver uses water to process ethanol. 1 glass of water per drink is a reasonable rule of thumb, not because it's going to prevent intoxication, but because it reduces next day dehydration as a compounding factor. Mind your frequency more than your quantity on any given occasion. Chronic daily drinking, even at low levels, is harder on the liver and the brain than the same total weekly volume consumed in less sessions. The liver needs recovery time. Give it some. And if you don't drink, don't start for health reasons. The research does not support that intervention. There are better ways to support cardiovascular health that don't involve introducing a carcinogen into the equation. Now, there is a clay tablet in the Penn Museum in Philadelphia. It's Sumerian. It's about 3,800 years old. On it, in cuneiform, is the hymn to Ninkasi, the goddess of beer. People have been singing the praises of this fermented grain water for longer than most of our other traditions have existed. They drank it to survive, to celebrate, to worship, to pay their workers, and to stay alive when the water would have killed them. We are lucky enough to live in a time when the water is mostly safe to drink, and we have the luxury of choosing whether to include beer in our lives rather than depending on it for survival. Choose thoughtfully. Drink well, but know what you're drinking and why. And if you're going to have a beer, for the love of everything, make it a good one. Eat and drink accordingly. That's episode 4 of Eat or Die, Stories from the Human Table. I'm Zach Sykes, Renegade Health Group. If you enjoyed this one, and I hope you did, share it with your friends who love craft beer, with your friends who think beer is bad for you, with anyone who's ever held a glass and wondered about the 10,000 years of history they just put in their hand. Leave us a review. We read everything, and we are building something here worth being a part of. Find us on Patreon, Instagram, and everywhere you get your social media. Next episode, we're done being nice. We've talked about protein, the things that build you. We've talked about grains, the thing that fed civilization. We talked about magnesium, the thing you're not getting enough of, and beer, the thing that built empires and occasionally ruins Sunday mornings. But next time, sugar. The sweetest thing we ever did to ourselves and possibly the most destructive. The history of how we went from a rare and precious luxury to the hidden ingredient in almost everything we eat. And a guide to actually navigating a food supply that has been, without exaggeration, engineered to make you consume more of it. It is going to be uncomfortable, it's going to be important, and it's going to make you read a label differently for the rest of your life. Until then, eat well.